Cold winds howled through the Wyoming Territory, but it was nothing compared to the chill that struck Elias Hayes when he saw his mail-order bride. He asked for a broad-shouldered pioneer. Instead, a trembling, soft-spoken widow stepped off the train, carrying a battered trunk and a terrifying, world-shattering secret. The Union Pacific steam engine groaned against the iron rails, exhaling a thick plume of gray smoke into the freezing Cheyenne air. It was October of 1883, and winter was already baring its teeth across the high plains. Elias Hayes stood on the wooden platform of the depot, a towering, solitary figure carved from the brutal isolation of the Wind River Range. At 34, Elias was a man made of scarred leather and hardened muscle, wearing a heavy buffalo hide coat that made him look more like a mountain grizzly than a prospective groom. He pulled his Stetson down low to shield his ice-blue eyes from the biting wind, a crumpled piece of paper clutched in his gloved hand. It was a clipping from the Heart and Hand matrimonial catalog, printed out of St. Louis. Elias hadn't placed the advertisement because he was lonely, nor because he possessed any lingering illusions of romance. The war had burned the romance out of him long ago, and 10 solitary years, trapping timber wolves and cutting lodgepole pines, had frozen whatever was left. He placed the ad because he had expanded his homestead, claiming another 400 acres under the Homestead Act, and a man simply couldn't run a cattle ranch, a trap line, and a functioning cabin on his own. He had been explicitly clear in his correspondence to the agency. Require a woman of sturdy constitution, must possess broad shoulders, calloused hands, and a practical mind, no delicate sensibilities. The work is harsh, the winters are deadly, and the nearest neighbor is 12 miles down a washed-out wagon trail. I need a partner for survival, not a parlor ornament. The agency had assured him that a widow named Beatrice Farnsworth, a robust, 6-foot-tall dairy farmer from Ohio, was on her way. As the passenger cars emptied, Elias watched the newcomers step onto the platform. His gaze scanned the crowd for the hulking farm widow he had been promised. He saw businessmen in bowler hats, a pair of dusty prospectors, and a frantic mother chasing 3 soot-stained children. The crowd thinned, the platform began to empty, and then the final passenger stepped out of the rear carriage. Elias's jaw tightened. She was not Beatrice Farnsworth. She couldn't have been more than 5'3", wrapped in a threadbare, faded velvet cloak that offered absolutely zero protection against the Wyoming wind. Beneath the inadequate coat, she possessed a lush, deeply feminine figure, soft, hourglass curves that drew the immediate, leering eyes of every roughneck on the platform. Her skin was the color of fresh cream, utterly untouched by the sun, and her hair was a mass of dark, chaotic curls pinned hastily beneath a mourning hat. She was shivering so violently that the small, battered leather trunk in her hands rattled against her knees. She looked around with wide, terrified hazel eyes, resembling a trapped doe surrounded by wolves. Elias stalked forward, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden boards. When he stopped in front of her, he towered over her by more than a foot. She flinched, instinctively taking a step back, her knuckles turning white around the handle of her trunk. "You the bride?" Elias's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, utterly devoid of warmth. The woman swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. "Are you Mr. Elias Hayes?" "I am. And you aren't the woman I paid passage for. Where is Mrs. Farnsworth?" The young woman looked down at the icy platform, her long, dark eyelashes trembling. "Mrs. Farnsworth. She took ill in Omaha, Mr. Hayes. She passed away from the cholera. The agency director, Mr. Abernathy, didn't want to lose your commission. He sent me instead." She looked up, a desperate, raw plea in her eyes. "My name is Elara Higgins." "I'm a veto, sir." Elias stared at her, disbelief warring with rising anger. He took in her delicate, uncalloused hands, her inappropriate city boots with their 2-inch heels, and the terrified way she held herself. "Mr. Abernathy is a fool," Elias spat out, turning his back on her. He marched over to the station master, a heavily bearded man named Jebediah Cobb, who was busy loading mailbags onto a cart. "Cobb, put her back on the train. I'm not taking her." Jebediah paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "Can't do it, Elias. Train's heading west to Sacramento, and her ticket was strictly one way to Cheyenne." Unless you're putting up the $40 for her return fare, she's staying right here. Elias swore under his breath. He turned back to Alara. She had followed him, dragging her heavy trunk, her chest heaving with exertion. "Mr. Hayes, please," Alara begged, her voice cracking. "I know I am not what you asked for, but I am a hard worker. I learn fast. I have nowhere else to go. If you leave me here, I will freeze to death in the streets." Elias looked at her. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he caught a flicker of something else, something hard and desperate. It was the look of a woman who was running from a fire and had decided to jump into a frozen river to survive. "You'll freeze to death on my mountain anyway," Elias said bluntly. "You don't have the meat on your bones to survive a Wind River winter, Mrs. Higgins, and I don't have the time to bury you." "Let me try," she whispered fiercely, stepping closer. A faint scent of lavender and old rain drifted off her, momentarily distracting him. "I promise you, Mr. Hayes, I won't be a burden." Elias stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The wind howled again, and Alara's teeth literally began to chatter. Cursing his own reluctant conscience, Elias snatched the heavy trunk from her delicate hands, as if it weighed nothing. "My wagon is out front," he grunted, not looking back. "Keep up." The journey up the mountain took 2 grueling days. Alara sat on the unforgiving wooden bench of the buckboard wagon, wrapped in 2 of Elias's spare wool blankets. She didn't complain once, though Elias could tell every bump in the rutted trail rattled her to the bone. When they camped the first night, she tried to help him build a fire, but her soft hands fumbled with the kindling, ending up with splintered fingers and unshed tears of frustration in her eyes. Elias remained stoic and silent, keeping his distance. He was convinced this was a catastrophic mistake. He had ordered a sturdy bride to share the unbearable load of frontier life. Instead, he had brought home a shivering, fragile porcelain doll. But as they crossed the tree line and the massive, isolated log cabin came into view against the jagged, snow-capped peaks, Elias had no idea that the real danger wasn't the winter ahead. The real danger was locked inside Alara's battered leather trunk. By the 3rd week of November, the Wyoming sky had turned the color of bruised iron, and the snowdrifts outside the cabin were 4 feet high. Inside the one-room cabin, the atmosphere was a volatile mix of stifling proximity and unspoken tension. To Elias's utter shock, Alara had not died, nor had she given up. What she lacked in physical strength and frontier knowledge, she made up for with a sheer, stubborn force of will that commanded his grudging respect. The first week had been a disaster. She had ruined a batch of sourdough, nearly burned the cabin down trying to operate the cast iron stove, and had returned from the woodpile with her hands blistered and bleeding. Elias had barked at her, telling her to sit down and stay out of his way. But Alara hadn't stayed down. Every time she failed, she observed him silently, her intelligent hazel eyes tracking his movements. By the 2nd week, she was baking edible bread. By the 3rd, she had learned to properly skin the rabbits he brought home, though her pale face turned a sickly green the entire time she did it. Yet, it wasn't just her determination that was getting under Elias's skin. It was the woman herself. The tight quarters made it impossible to ignore her. When she bent over the hearth to stir the stew, her faded dresses pulled taut against the lush curve of her hips, causing Elias to suddenly find reasons to go outside and chop more wood in the freezing cold. At night, a heavy canvas curtain separated her cot from his bed, but he could hear her soft breathing in the dark. He could smell the lingering scent of her lavender soap. For a man who had isolated himself from the warmth of human touch for a decade, her presence was agonizingly intoxicating. But there was a dark shadow hanging over Alara. Elias was a hunter, trained to spot the signs of wounded prey, and Alara displayed all of them. She was unnaturally jumpy. If a piece of firewood popped too loudly in the hearth, she would flinch, her hands immediately flying to protect her face. When the wind shrieked through the eaves, her eyes would dart toward the heavy oak door, filled with a primal, suffocating terror. And then there was the trunk. She kept the battered leather box shoved securely beneath her cot. Whenever Elias even walked near that side of the room, her body would tense, her gaze locking onto the trunk with desperate ferocity. She claimed it held her late husband's personal effects, but the sheer paranoia she projected suggested something far more valuable, or dangerous. The breaking point came in the 1st week of December, when the worst blizzard of the decade slammed into the Wind River Range. The wind tore at the cabin roof, packing snow against the windows until the interior was plunged into perpetual twilight. On the second day of the storm, Alara fell terribly ill. It started with a cough, and by nightfall, she was burning with a raging mountain fever. She lay on her cot, tossing in delirium, her skin flushed red and slick with sweat. Elias worked frantically, pressing cold, snow-soaked rags to her forehead and trying to force willow bark tea past her chapped lips. "Don't let him in," she murmured feverishly, thrashing her head side to side, her hands clutching weakly at Elias's flannel shirt. "Please, God, don't let him find me." "No one's coming, Alara," Elias said, his voice unusually gentle, his large calloused hand stroking her damp curls. The sheer surge of fierce, protective instinct that flooded his chest terrified him. He realized then, staring down at her flushed face, that he was falling in love with this strange, resilient woman. "You're safe here. I've got you." "The money," she gasped, her eyes rolling back. "He'll kill me for the money." Elias frowned, his hand freezing on her forehead. "Money?" Alara let out a ragged gasp, her breathing growing distressingly shallow. Elias knew if her fever didn't break by morning, she would be dead. He remembered that she had mentioned a tin of strong camphor ointment in her belongings when she first arrived. He didn't want to violate her privacy, but desperation forced his hand. He pulled the heavy leather trunk from beneath her cot. It was locked with a heavy brass padlock. Grabbing his heavy iron fire poker, Elias jammed it through the hasp and twisted violently. The metal snapped with a sharp crack. He threw the lid open. There were no clothes inside, no keepsakes of a peaceful life. Instead, the trunk was filled with stacks of banded United States currency. Stacks of it. Elias had never seen so much money in his life. There had to be upwards of $20,000 inside. But what caught his eye wasn't the fortune. It was the heavy, red wax seals on the paper bands wrapping the money. They bore the official stamp of the Union Pacific Railroad Express. Elias's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He pushed the money aside, his hands suddenly feeling numb. Beneath the stacks of stolen cash lay a crumpled, blood-stained wanted poster issued by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, distributed out of the Laramie Boomerang press office. $10,000. Reward, dead or alive, for the capture of Josiah Ghost Hayes. Wanted for murder, train robbery, and high treason. Elias stopped breathing. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thin, as if the blizzard outside had sucked all the oxygen from the room. Hayes. With trembling hands, Elias reached into the very bottom of the trunk and pulled out a small, framed, tin-type photograph. The photograph showed a younger, vibrant Alara. She was wearing a beautiful wedding dress, a hesitant smile on her lips. Standing beside her, with his arm wrapped possessively around her waist, was a man. A handsome man with a sharp jawline, cold eyes, and a familiar scar slicing through his left eyebrow. It was Caleb, Elias's younger brother. The brother Elias had watched take a Confederate musket ball to the chest at Gettysburg. The brother Elias had carried off the battlefield. The brother whose empty coffin Elias had buried on their family plot in Ohio after the military hospital declared him dead. Elias had spent the last 10 years agonizing over his failure to protect Caleb, punishing himself with a life of harsh isolation in these mountains out of guilt. But Caleb wasn't dead. He hadn't died a hero. He had survived, assumed a new name, and become one of the most ruthless, bloodthirsty outlaws in the Western Territories. Elias's hands shook violently as the pieces slammed together with devastating, heartbreaking clarity. Alara wasn't a random widow. Alara was his monstrous brother's abused, runaway wife. She hadn't ended up in Cheyenne by accident. She had sought out the matrimonial agency. She had specifically answered his advertisement. Because she knew that Caleb Ghost Hayes, the butcher of the Union Pacific, was absolutely terrified of only one man on God's green earth, his older brother, Elias. She hadn't come here to be a wife. She had come here using Elias as a human shield. Suddenly, a folded piece of parchment slipped from the back of the photograph frame and fluttered to the floorboard. Elias picked it up. It was a telegram, dated just 3 days before Alara's arrival in Cheyenne, addressed to Alara in Omaha. It read, "You can run, my sweet wife, but you cannot hide with my money. I know exactly whose bed you are climbing into. I am coming for you both. Keep the hearth warm for me, brother. Caleb." The wind screamed outside, rattling the cabin door on its iron hinges. Elias looked at the shivering woman in his bed, the stolen fortune in the trunk, and the undeniable truth in his hands. His brother was alive, his bride was a liar, and hell was currently riding up the mountain to claim them both. For 48 hours, the blizzard screamed against the log walls, while Alara hovered on the precipice of death. Elias did not sleep. He boiled willow bark, rubbed the biting camphor ointment onto her chest, and forced water down her throat drop by drop. But his hands moved with mechanical detachment. His mind was consumed by the horrific betrayal sitting open in the center of the room. On the morning of the third day, the wind finally broke, leaving behind a suffocating, frozen silence. Alara's fever broke with the storm. She opened her eyes, her breathing weak but steady, and slowly pushed herself up on her elbows. The cabin was freezing, the hearth fire reduced to glowing embers. She turned her head, and her heart stopped. Elias sat in a wooden chair beside the stove. Across his lap lay a fully loaded 1,873 Winchester repeating rifle. At his feet sat her open trunk, the $20,000 of Union Pacific currency spilling over the edges alongside the Pinkerton wanted poster, and the tin-type photograph of her and Caleb. Elias looked at her. His ice-blue eyes were hollow, stripped of the grudging affection that had begun to blossom over the past month. He looked like the unforgiving mountain outside. "Is there a single truth you've spoken since you stepped off that train?" Elias's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a razor. Alara pulled the wool blanket tight against her chest, tears immediately spilling over her pale cheeks. She didn't look away. "My name is Alara. I am a widow. Or at least, I prayed I would be by the time I reached you." "He's my brother," the words tore from Elias's throat, rough and agonized. "I mourned him. I buried an empty pine box for him, and you brought his ghost to my door." "I brought his punishment," Alara countered, her voice trembling but surprisingly fierce. She swung her legs over the cot, ignoring her weakness. "Do you know what he is, Elias? He isn't the boy you saved at Gettysburg. He is a monster." She pulled down the collar of her faded nightgown, exposing a brutal, jagged scar that slashed across her collarbone. She rolled up her sleeve to reveal the faded, purple-yellow marks of a man's heavy grip. Elias's jaw clenched so hard his teeth groaned, his knuckles turning white around the rifle. "He kept a journal," Alara whispered, fresh tears falling, a locked ledger of his robberies, his murders, and his secrets. "I found it when I was searching for a way to escape. He wrote about you, Elias. He wrote that the only man he feared in this world was his older brother. He knew you survived. He knew you lived in the Wind River Range. He wrote that if you ever found out what he had become, you would deliver the judgment of God upon him." Alara stood up, her knees shaking, and pointed at the trunk. "I didn't just run. I crippled him. I stole the Union Pacific payload his gang slaughtered 5 men for. Without that money, his men will turn on him. But I knew he would hunt me down to the ends of the earth. I needed a shield. I found the matrimonial catalog in his coat pocket. He kept your advertisement just to mock you to his whores. So, I used it." She took a staggering step toward him, dropping to her knees on the rough-hewn floorboards before him. "I used you, Elias. I am sorry. I was desperate, and I was terrified, and I wanted to live. You can give me back to him when he comes. You can give him the money. But please, do not let him take me alive." Elias stared down at the trembling, sobbing woman. He had demanded a woman with broad shoulders and calloused hands. He had thought Alara was weak because she couldn't swing an axe. But as he looked at her now, he realized the sheer, unimaginable strength it took to rob a ruthless outlaw kingpin, cross the freezing country alone, and walk willingly into the wilderness to face him. She wasn't a fragile porcelain doll. She was forged steel. Elias stood up. He walked past her, kicking the trunk shut with his heavy boot. "Get up, Alara," he said, his voice shedding its coldness, replaced by a low, deadly calm. She looked up, confused. "What?" "If Caleb sent that telegram 3 days before you arrived, and he was delayed by the same blizzard we were. Elias glanced out the frosted window at the blinding expanse of white. He will be at the bottom of the ridge by nightfall. Elias moved swiftly to his armory trunk, his military instincts taking over. He laid out his defenses with lethal precision. The 1,873 Winchester rifle, fully loaded with 15 rounds. A double-barreled 1-2 gauge shotgun, packed with buckshot. His heavy Colt single-action army revolver, the barrel oiled and gleaming. 3 steel-jawed wolf traps, which he immediately hauled out the back door to bury in the snowdrifts around the perimeter. "You aren't giving me to him?" Alara asked, her voice hitching as she watched him work. Elias paused, turning to look at her. The shadows of the cabin cast sharp angles across his scarred face. "I spent 10 years punishing myself for failing to protect my little brother. I won't spend the rest of my life punishing myself for failing to protect my wife. Now load that shotgun." They came precisely at dawn. The morning was blindingly bright, the fresh snow reflecting the harsh Wyoming sun in a dazzling icy glare. Elias sat in the dark of the cabin, the heavy wooden shutters securely barred, watching through a narrow firing slit he had carved into the timber years ago. Alara crouched beside the stone hearth, the heavy 1-2 gauge resting across her lap, her knuckles white as bone. "Hello, the house." The voice echoed across the frozen clearing. It was smooth, mocking, and laced with a terrifying familiarity that sent a physical jolt through Elias's chest. Through the narrow slit, Elias saw 3 riders breach the tree line. 2 were hardened gunslingers wrapped in heavy canvas dusters. But the man in the center wore a tailored black coat, Caleb Hayes. The scar over his eye was new, but the cruel, arrogant smirk was exactly as Elias remembered. "Elias, open the door, brother," Caleb shouted, his voice ringing through the pines. "It's been a long time. I hear you're keeping something that belongs to me warm in your bed." Elias slipped to the back door, lifting the heavy iron bar. He looked back at Alara. "Stay away from the windows. If anyone but me comes through that door, you pull both triggers." Alara nodded, her hazel eyes locked onto his with fierce, unwavering trust. "Come back to me." Elias slipped out into the biting cold, melting into the deep snowdrifts behind the woodpile. In the front, Caleb grew impatient. "Bo! Levi! Burn the cabin out! Shoot the mountain man when he runs! Bring me my wife and my trunk!" The 2 thugs dismounted, pulling rifles from their scabbards. They began to trudge through the waist-deep powder. Levi took the left flank, his eyes fixed on the barred windows. He took a blind step backward to get a better angle. A sharp, metallic snap echoed like a cannon shot. Levi screamed, a shrill, agonizing sound, as the steel jaws of Elias's hidden wolf trap shattered his shin. Bo spun toward the sound, raising his rifle, completely exposed. From the woodpile, Elias's Winchester roared. The heavy bullet caught Bo dead in the chest, throwing the outlaw backward into a snowbank. Caleb's horse reared in panic. Caleb cursed, throwing himself from the saddle just as Elias fired a second time, the bullet splintering the saddle horn where Caleb's chest had been a fraction of a second prior. "Still hiding in the mud? Elias?" Caleb screamed, pulling his twin revolvers and returning blind fire. Bullets chewed through the pine logs, sending deadly splinters flying into Elias's cheek. Elias racked the lever of his Winchester, bursting from cover. He fired twice, forcing Caleb to dive behind the water trough. "You dishonored our name, Caleb." "They were in my way," Caleb laughed. "Just like she is." Caleb popped up, firing rapidly. Elias felt a searing heat punch through his left shoulder. The impact spun him around, dropping the Winchester into the snow. Gritting his teeth against the blinding pain, he dropped to his knees behind the buckboard wagon, clutching his bleeding arm. Hearing the rifle fall, Caleb stepped out, a wicked grin spreading across his face. He cocked both revolvers, walking slowly toward the wagon. "I always was the faster shot, big brother. Tell Alara I said hello." The heavy oak door of the cabin suddenly flew open. Caleb halted. Alara stood in the doorway, the freezing wind whipping her dark curls. The oversized shotgun was pressed firmly into her shoulder. She looked like a judge delivering a sentence. "Alara, my sweet," Caleb sneered, aiming his right revolver at her. "Put that cannon down." "You should have killed me, Caleb," Alara said softly. She pulled both triggers. The roar was deafening. The massive recoil knocked Alara flat, but the spread of heavy buckshot shredded the wooden water trough beside Caleb. Heavy, jagged shards of oak exploded outward, a piece of shrapnel embedding itself deep into Caleb's gun arm. He shrieked, dropping his weapon. Pushing through the agonizing pain in his shoulder, Elias lunged from behind the wagon. He hit Caleb with the force of a charging grizzly, driving his younger brother into the snow. Caleb thrashed wildly, slashing with a hunting knife. Elias caught Caleb's wrist. 10 years of fighting the wild had given Elias unmatched strength. He twisted his brother's wrist with a sickening crack, then brought his massive fist down across Caleb's jaw. The outlaw went limp. Silence rushed back into the clearing. Elias stood up, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Elira scrambled to her feet, running through the deep snow to crash into his chest. He held her tight. The ghost was dead. 6 months later, the spring thaw had turned the valley green. U.S. Marshal Heck Thomas had carted Caleb away to face the hangman, and the $10,000 bounty allowed Elias and Alara to expand into the largest cattle ranch in the territory. Elias stood on the porch of their new timber home, watching the sunset. Elara stepped out, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She wore a tailored denim dress, her lush curves leaning against his solid side. "Looking for trouble, Mr. Hayes?" she teased. Elias wrapped his thick arm around her. "No, Mrs. Hayes," he rumbled with a rare smile, "just admiring the absolute sturdiest thing on this mountain." Did the twists of Elias and Alara's treacherous frontier romance keep you on the edge of your seat? The Wild West was built on brutal truths, hidden pasts, and love that forged itself in the fires of survival. If you love this audio drama, don't leave us out in the cold. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical sagas, and share this video with a friend who loves a rugged Western romance. See you next time.